Today, I'm sharing an intense and shocking story that unfolded during a first-class flight when a pilot targeted Melania Trump with hostility. No one could have predicted the incredible turn of events that followed. This is a story about courage, unity, and standing up against injustice. Stay tuned for the full story. Melania Trump sat elegantly in the luxurious first-class cabin, gazing out the airplane window as the evening sun cast its golden glow over the tarmac. The hum of boarding passengers filled the air, but Melania barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. Suddenly, a loud, aggressive voice broke the calm. "Excuse me, but what is she doing here?" barked the pilot, his sharp tone cutting through the atmosphere like a blade. He was glaring directly at Melania. Passengers froze, their eyes darting between the pilot and the former First Lady. If you're wondering how this all unfolded and what happens next, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the shocking turn of events that changed everything. Melania looked up, confused but composed. "Is there a problem, sir?" she asked, her voice steady. The tension in the room was unmistakable. The pilot sneered. "Yes, there is a problem. People like you don't belong here. This is first class, not some charity ride." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Melania's heart sank, not for herself, but for what the moment represented. She had faced criticism and scrutiny before. This wasn't new. What struck her was the hatred in the pilot's eyes. It wasn't about her seat, it was something deeper, uglier. Passengers began whispering among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. An older woman sitting nearby leaned toward Melania and whispered, "Are you okay, dear?" Melania nodded, offering a polite smile. But the pilot wasn't done. He stepped closer, pointing a finger at her like a judge delivering a sentence. "I don't care who you are. You're not staying in this cabin. Either you move, or I'll have you removed from this flight." At that moment, Melania's calm demeanor shifted. She stood up slowly, her poise commanding attention. The murmurs stopped. All eyes were on her. "Sir," she said, her voice firm but measured, "I have a ticket for this seat. I belong here as much as anyone else. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to enjoy my flight." The pilot smirked, crossing his arms. "We'll see about that," he said before storming off toward the cockpit, leaving a trail of tension behind him. The passengers were visibly uncomfortable, but no one dared to intervene. Melania sat back down, her hands resting gracefully on the armrests. She wasn't angry, she was calculating. Something about the man's hostility didn't sit right, and she wasn't going to let it slide. Unbeknownst to everyone on board, a storm was brewing, not just in the air, but in the hearts of those witnessing this confrontation. What was about to happen next would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew. Minutes passed, but the tension lingered in the cabin like a storm cloud. The pilot hadn't returned yet, but his words hung heavy in the air. Melania noticed the anxious glances passengers were throwing her way. Some seemed sympathetic, while others looked hesitant, unsure of how to react. A flight attendant, a young woman with a nervous smile, approached cautiously. "Ma'am," she whispered, leaning down slightly. "Is everything all right? I overheard what the captain said. If you'd prefer, I can see about moving you to another seat." Melania looked at her, her expression unreadable for a moment. "Thank you," she replied softly. "But I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to be here." The attendant nodded, a hint of admiration flashing across her face, though her concern remained. "Just let me know if you need anything," she added, before hurrying back down the aisle. Then, the unexpected happened. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we're experiencing a delay. There's a security concern we need to address." Melania froze. Security concern? The pilot's earlier hostility suddenly made sense. He wasn't just being rude, he was trying to paint her as a threat. It was a calculated move meant to justify his actions. Passengers began murmuring again, their whispers growing louder as speculation spread. A man across the aisle leaned forward. "Is he talking about you?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and unease. Melania didn't answer. Instead, she reached for her phone and opened the camera app. If things escalated, she wanted to make sure there was a record. Just then, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The murmurs turned into an audible buzz. Melania watched as the officers made their way down the aisle, their eyes scanning the passengers. They stopped. In front of her, one of the officers spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice professional but firm, "we need you to come with us." Melania's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She stood up gracefully, her calm poise making the officers hesitate for just a moment. "May I ask why?" she inquired. "We've been informed of a potential issue," the officer replied vaguely. The cabin fell silent. All eyes were on Melania and the officers. Some passengers looked outraged, others just stunned. But then one voice broke through the quiet. "This is ridiculous." It was the older woman who had spoken to Melania earlier. She stood up, her face flushed with anger. "That woman hasn't done anything wrong. I saw the whole thing. It's the pilot who's out of line." Her outburst seemed to embolden others. A man in a business suit chimed in. "Yeah, I've been sitting here the whole time. She's done nothing but mind her own business." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unprepared for the passengers' vocal support. One of them spoke into his radio, trying to figure out how to handle the escalating situation. Melania remained composed, though inside she felt a wave of unease. Not because of the confrontation, she was accustomed to being a target. What moved her was the strangers standing up for her, people who didn't owe her anything but refused to stay silent. And yet, the pilot hadn't shown his hand completely. Whatever was coming next wasn't just about Melania. It was about something far bigger. The truth was about to come crashing down. As the confrontation unfolded, the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch. The security officers hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the passengers' defiance. One officer turned away briefly to speak into his radio, while the other shifted uncomfortably under the weight of so many eyes. Meanwhile, Melania remained standing, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around her. The older woman wasn't done yet. She stepped forward, her voice firm. "I don't care who you think you are. This woman has been polite and quiet the entire time. If anyone should be escorted off this plane, it's that pilot." Her words landed like a thunderclap. The murmurs grew louder, passengers' indignation rising like a wave. "She's right," one shouted. "We've all seen what's happening here." The pilot suddenly reappeared, his face flushed with anger. "Enough!" he barked, his voice cutting through the commotion. He pointed directly at Melania, his hand trembling with rage. "I don't care what these people say. This flight doesn't leave until she's off the plane." Melania turned to face him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "And why is that?" she asked, her voice calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is it because of something I've done? Or is it because of who you think I am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The pilot faltered for a moment, but his expression soon hardened. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "You might have everyone else fooled, but I know trouble when I see it." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers shouted over each other, some calling for the pilot to be removed, others demanding answers. The security officers looked overwhelmed, unsure of how to regain control. A man in the back of the cabin stood up. He was older, with a weathered face and the air of someone who had seen his fair share of battles. "Enough of this nonsense," he said, his voice deep and commanding. The noise subsided as heads turned toward him. "I recognize that woman," he continued, pointing to Melania. "And I think the rest of you do too. That's Melania Trump, former First Lady of the United States." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Melania felt a wave of unease wash over her as the revelation sank in. She wasn't ashamed of her identity, but she had hoped to avoid the spotlight, to simply exist without the weight of her name. The pilot's face twisted into a sneer. "So what? That doesn't give her the right to act entitled." "Entitled!" the older man shot back. "The only one acting entitled here is you. I don't care who she is or isn't. Your behavior is unacceptable." The security officers seemed to sense the tide turning. One of them stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, we need to de-escalate this situation. If you continue to provoke the passengers, we may have to ask you to leave." The pilot's jaw dropped, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. This time, it was Melania. "I think we've had enough drama for one flight," she said, her tone measured. If you'd like me to leave, I will. But know this. Every moment of this has been recorded, and I won't let your actions go unanswered. The pilot looked as if he had been slapped. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder again as passengers began holding up their phones, some openly filming the confrontation. For a brief moment, it felt like the entire plane was holding its breath. Then the unexpected happened. One of the security officers turned to Melania and said, "You don't have to go anywhere, ma'am. Please take your seat." The cabin erupted into cheers. But Melania didn't move. Something told her this wasn't over yet. The pilot's eyes burned with fury. Melania could see that whatever was coming next would be his final, desperate move. His rage boiled over as he slammed a fist against the cabin wall. "This is my plane!" he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of his anger. "I decide who stays and who goes." The cheers turned to gasps of disbelief. Passengers began whispering to one another, their disdain for the pilot spreading like wildfire. The older man from the back stood again, raising his hand to silence the murmurs. "Your plane?" he said, his voice steady, but biting. "Last I checked, this plane belongs to the airline, not to your ego. You're supposed to be a professional, but all I see is a man drunk on power, trying to humiliate someone who hasn't done a thing wrong." The words stung, and the pilot took a step back, momentarily at a loss for a response. But his silence didn't last long. "This isn't about power," he barked. "It's about rules, and I'm the one who enforces them." "Rules?" Melania interjected, her voice firm but calm. "What rule did I break? Tell everyone here what I've done to deserve being singled out like this." The pilot hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The truth was, he had no legitimate answer. His actions had been driven by personal bias, and now, cornered by the weight of public scrutiny, he was struggling to find a way out. One of the security officers stepped forward, addressing the pilot directly. "Sir, you need to calm down," he said, his tone professional but stern. "You're creating a disturbance, and it's our job to ensure the safety of everyone on board." The pilot's face twisted in disbelief. "You're taking her side?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "We're taking the side of what's right," the officer replied. "And right now, you're the one jeopardizing this flight." Passengers erupted into applause, their support for Melania growing stronger with every passing moment. The pilot, clearly outnumbered and outmatched, looked around desperately, searching for someone to back him up. But no one did. Even the flight attendants, who had been silent until now, exchanged nervous glances before one of them finally stepped forward. "Captain," she said softly, her voice tinged with regret, "I think it's best if you step aside. This situation has escalated far beyond what's acceptable." The pilot's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out again, but then something in his expression shifted, perhaps the realization that he had lost control, or the sheer weight of the passenger's judgment pressing down on him. He spat, his words dripping with bitterness. "Let her stay. But this isn't over." With that, he stormed out of the cabin, leaving behind a trail of stunned silence. Melania exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since the ordeal began. She turned to the passengers, offering a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said simply. The older woman who had defended her earlier reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You didn't deserve any of this," she said warmly. "And don't worry, we'll make sure the world knows what really happened here." Melania nodded, her gratitude evident in her eyes. But as she sat down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the pilot's ominous parting words were more than just empty threats. Something told her this battle was far from over. As the plane finally prepared for takeoff, Melania couldn't help but wonder what the pilot's next move would be, and how it might impact not just her, but everyone on board. The plane ascended smoothly into the skies, the tension in the cabin finally beginning to dissipate. Passengers exchanged relieved glances, some even offering Melania encouraging smiles. Yet, despite the calm exterior, an undercurrent of unease lingered. The pilot's parting words echoed in Melania's mind like a warning bell that refused to be silenced. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, their professionalism masking the storm that had unfolded just moments ago. Melania accepted a glass of water, her fingers brushing against the cup as she tried to ground herself in the present. Across the aisle, the elderly veteran who had first stood up for her raised his drink in a silent toast of solidarity. "Keep your head up," the man said softly, his voice carrying. Melania sat quietly in the luxurious first-class cabin, her composed demeanor masking the storm of emotions swirling within. As the flight continued, the elderly veteran beside her leaned in once again, his voice steady and reassuring. "People like that only have power if we let them. You've handled this with grace, but don't let your guard down." Melania offered him a grateful smile. "Thank you. It's comforting to know there are still good people willing to stand up for what's right." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their unease growing with every passing moment. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, and the pilot's voice, strained and angry, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach our cruising altitude, I want to address what happened earlier. Rules and order exist for a reason, and no one is above them, not even privileged passengers who think they can do as they please." The passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The thinly veiled jab at Melania sparked murmurs of disapproval. She remained calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her mind raced with possibilities. What would he do next? A few minutes later, the plane jolted unexpectedly. Gasps echoed through the cabin as a flight attendant hurried to reassure the passengers. "Just some turbulence," she said, her forced smile betraying her nerves. Melania's instincts told her otherwise. Through the frosted glass of the cockpit door, she could see the shadow of the pilot pacing erratically. The veteran leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's unstable. Be ready for anything." Melania nodded, her resolve hardening. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This was about safety, not just hers, but everyone's on board. Suddenly, the cockpit door swung open with a bang, slamming against the wall. The pilot stormed out, his eyes wild and his breathing ragged. Gasps filled the cabin as he marched down the aisle, his gaze fixed on Melania. "You think you're untouchable?" he snarled, stopping in front of her. "Think again." Before Melania could respond, the elderly veteran stood, planting himself firmly between her and the pilot. His voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Enough. You've crossed the line. Sit down and do your job, or I'll make sure you never fly again." The passengers watched in stunned silence. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. A young woman stood up, clutching her phone tightly. "I've recorded everything," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "If you don't stop, this goes online, and your career is over." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin as others held up their phones, some already streaming the unfolding drama live. The pilot's bravado faltered, his eyes darting to the sea of phones pointed at him. His sneer wavered, replaced by uncertainty. "That's enough," said the lead flight attendant, stepping forward with authority, flanked by two of her colleagues. "Captain, return to the cockpit now, or we'll have no choice but to restrain you." The pilot hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching. The threat of public exposure and the growing support for Melania left him with no way out. With a furious snarl, he stormed back toward the cockpit. "You'll regret this," he spat over his shoulder. Melania let out a slow breath, her composure intact despite the chaos. The veteran sat down beside her, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "You handled that well," he said, giving her a nod of respect. Melania smiled faintly, but her eyes remained fixed on the front of the cabin. She knew this wasn't over. Whatever the pilot's next move would be, she would be ready. For now, though, she took solace in the support of the passengers around her, strangers who had stood together against injustice. Slamming the door behind her, a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin, though the tension lingered. The veteran turned to Melania, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You handled yourself well," he said, his voice steady and encouraging. Melania offered a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without the support of people like you," she replied, her tone calm but filled with gratitude. As the flight continued, passengers rallied around Melania, offering words of encouragement and support. The young woman who had recorded the incident uploaded the footage online, and within minutes, it went viral. News outlets picked up the story, and hashtags like "Stand with Melania" and "Justice in the Skies" began trending worldwide. By the time the plane landed, a crowd of reporters and supporters had gathered at the terminal. As Melania stepped off the plane, she was met with cheers and applause. The veteran walked beside her, a quiet pillar of strength. A reporter pushed forward, microphone in hand. "Mrs. Trump, what do you have to say about what happened on the flight?" Melania paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "It's about standing up to injustice, no matter where it happens. No one deserves to be treated like they're less than human. We are all in this together." The crowd erupted into applause. As Melania and the veteran walked away, the world watched, inspired by their courage and resilience. Later that evening, Melania sat in her hotel room, scrolling through countless messages of support. She knew the fight against prejudice and injustice wasn't over, but this was a step in the right direction. Closing her eyes, she reflected on something profound. Sometimes the most unexpected battles lead to the most meaningful victories. In those moments, standing up, even when it's hard, can change the world. This story reminds us of the importance of courage, unity, and standing against injustice, no matter the circumstances. Melania Trump's calm demeanor and the support of those around her demonstrate how collective action and integrity can triumph over prejudice and hate. Let's carry this lesson forward in our own lives. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching.